Hi, so my name is Carolyn Snell from the Department of Social Policy and Social Work at the University of York. I'm going to talk to you today about my research around fuel poverty and people with disabilities in England. So I was asked to tell you a bit more about myself and my story before I go on to talking about my research. I got my big break in 2011 when I was funded by a charity, Eager Charitable Trust, to undertake my first piece of research into fuel poverty. And at the time, the country was going through really big post-crash policy changes, changes related to austerity. So we saw huge changes around social security, a lot of welfare reforms, a lot of cuts to welfare benefits. We also saw a lot of changes around housing and also energy policy. And within the field of social policy, there was real concern that these changes would have a negative impact on people with disabilities. There was less concern within the field of energy policy, and the more I investigated it, the more I started to realise that the changes around energy policy and also around social security and housing were likely to converge to have a real impact on people with disabilities. And people with disabilities were regarded as a sort of priority group for policymakers. But again, the more I looked into this, I realised that this was based on a very, very limited evidence base. So it was on this basis that I thought it was important to start to investigate the relationship between fuel poverty and disability, which is what I'll talk to you over the next few slides. So before I talk about specifically about people with disabilities and fuel poverty, I just need to very briefly talk about some of the definitions that we use at the moment. So in England, fuel poverty is measured using a low income, high cost indicator. And under this indicator, a household is considered to be fuel poor if they have required fuel costs that are above average, and if they were to spend this amount of fuel, they'd be left with a residual income below the official poverty line. And in England, there are usually three things that determine whether or not a household is likely to be in fuel poverty. And that is usually having a low household income, having higher than average energy requirements, so you're using a lot of energy within the home. It might be because you've got poor energy efficiency, it might be because there are a lot of people in the household, or it might be that fuel prices are particularly high. It might be that the type of fuel you're using is particularly expensive. And in terms of policy, historically there are three government-defined groups that have been supported through policy. It's usually the elderly, people with disabilities and very young children. These have been regarded by policymakers as the most vulnerable to the effects of fuel poverty. So I'd like to move on now and think about fuel poverty and people with disabilities more specifically. And as I said at the start, I think one of the real weaknesses of the existing research, certainly in 2011 when I started in this field, was that the existing research and also policy treated people with disabilities as a homogenous group. So as a single group with very, very similar needs. And actually, as you start to unpick the evidence base, what we see is that there are highly varied needs, highly varying energy needs, and also the impacts of fuel poverty are felt very differently, depending on the different types of impairment or condition the disabled person has. However, there are a few common points that occur across the evidence base, and that is that there are many types of health condition and disability that require a higher ambient temperature. So for example, you might need to heat your home to 22, 23 degrees rather than 20, 21 degrees in order to stay relatively healthy. Equally, there are other conditions where the person might need to have a longer period of warmth throughout the day and throughout the night to prevent their condition from worsening. also we see the need for additional energy use within the home. So it might be for running a dehumidifier, for running equipment, for running an air conditioner. But there are lots of reasons why there might be increased needs for using energy. And all of these things point towards increased energy costs, which I think is the really important takeaway point from here. I think it's also worth highlighting that there's a really strong link in the literature between poverty and disability. If you have a disability, you're much more likely to be in poverty and experience all the other inequalities that go hand in hand with that. So it's now worth putting this in context and looking at the most recent English fuel poverty statistics. This draws on the 2018 English Housing Survey. So this table here gives you the percentage of households that are in fuel poverty and that also have a long-term illness or disability. And what we can see from this table is that 11.7% of households with a disability or long-term illness are also in fuel poverty. What we can also see is that out of all of the fuel poor households, 40.3% have a disability or long-term illness. So my research has been very critical of the official statistics and the way in which we measure fuel poverty. There's a number of reasons for this. I think the first reason is I was speaking earlier about the diverse range of energy needs of people with disabilities, and that these often have a tendency towards a greater energy expenditure. These are simply not recognised within the official definition of fuel poverty. It's very much a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. So it doesn't recognise those potentially additional energy costs, but it also has the potential of exaggerating people's incomes. So where you've got a household where somebody is in receipt of a disability-related benefit, the official measurement of fuel poverty calculates that benefit as a form of disposable income. So when it comes to actually working out whether or not somebody's in fuel poverty, they're less likely to fall below the poverty line and be defined as being fuel poor, because they've got that additional income in there. So again, it exaggerates their incomes potentially. So I would argue that amongst the existing figures, so the 11.7% statistic we were looking at before, I would say that that has a real masking effect in terms of the extent of the actual problem. So Harriet Thompson and I did some work a good few years ago now, looking at the impact of these different ways of measuring and the different using different forms of income. So for example, under the existing measure, the low income high cost measure, if you removed these disability related benefits from the calculation of income, a further 1.2% of households containing somebody with a disability were then defined as fuel poor. It's also worth noting that in England we changed the definition of fuel poverty in around 2012-2013. I don't have time now to explain the old definition, but under it 20.4% of households with somebody with a disability were defined as fuel poor. And then when we took out these disability related benefits, a further 2% were defined as fuel poor. As I say, the definition changed, and then suddenly we moved from a situation where 20.4% of households with people with disabilities were in fuel poverty down to 13.2% of households with people with disabilities. I don't believe for a minute that the situation got any better for these households. It was simply by changing the way in which we measured it. And it concerns me that we can suddenly lose around 7% of very vulnerable households simply by changing the definition. And I think it has quite an undermining effect on the needs of and the recognition of people with disabilities. I think it's also important to recognise that we could look at the official statistics. We could look at that 11.7% fuel poverty rate amongst people with disabilities and say, well, that's relatively low. That's not a huge problem. Perhaps there are other indicators of vulnerability that are more important. However, I think what we've really got to recognise is the potentially catastrophic impacts of not having a secure energy supply on some people with disabilities. So I've included a quotation here. This is a household with a disabled child who's kept on a feeding machine overnight, so she has to be fed throughout the night for 12 hours. This household uses a prepayment meter, so where you put a card into the meter and you pay as you go, like you would with a phone. She has an agreement with the energy company that her electricity supply won't go off even if she hasn't paid enough onto her meter, but it still does. And if her daughter's machine goes off, this has absolutely catastrophic life-changing implications. So I think it's really, really important to recognise that within the context of the statistics we've just been looking at. So moving on from the official statistics and thinking a bit more broadly about the sort of energy policy area, this is certainly where my research has moved into in the last 5 years. One of the main policy responses for people in fuel poverty is support with housing. So it's usually through retrofit, so the energy efficiency improvements to windows, to the roof, to the floor, those sorts of things. And as I've already said, people with disabilities are regarded as a priority vulnerable group. However, by continuing to fail to consult in a structured way, in a systematic way, seems a real kind of oversight. There still seems to be a lack of knowledge about how to provide support for people with disabilities. There seems to be a lack of knowledge about what it is that people with disabilities might need. And I appreciate that this is not a homogenous group whatsoever, but I think there has to be a starting point of actually trying to understand the needs a little bit better, and that really seems to be lacking at the moment. So I think, just to follow on from my previous point, I just wanted to conclude by saying we need to start listening a bit more and stop assuming that we know what the needs of people with disabilities actually are. So I'm going to leave you with 3 quotations from some of the people that we've worked with over the last 10 years, just to leave on their voice, not mine. So thank you.